It's great to be here, particularly because of the meeting that we had in April. And on my title slide, I've got a picture of us all sitting there in New Delhi. There's me, there's Donna, there's Sebastian, and the meeting there we had, I think, was one of the most important meetings that I've had this year. A really important meeting, because as Donna will tell you, that when we start these things off, we are seen as a little bit mad, a bit weird. And people there got what we were talking about right away, and it was really a really important meeting. And the archives, the photo archives at AIS, absolutely tremendous, a real treasure house. Fantastic. I couldn't believe some of the things that I saw when I went to the archive room. And there's Sebastian and I having a day off at the Taj Mahal as well, so we had a great time as well. So I've been asked to talk about the practical issues around open data and linking cultural heritage data. I did this diagram for another presentation. I did a presentation earlier in the year to the French academic libraries, the university libraries, and what they wanted to talk about was how you changed a library OPAC so that when you search, when a researcher came in and started typing away and looking at the library resources, they also got related resources from lots of different institutions so that their OPAC became more universal and researchers didn't have to go to different places, and those resources were already linked. But there are a lot of practical issues around this that we've had to try and work out in the last 5 years. I've been working on this for 5 years, initially with a small grant to look at feasibility and gradually building up into a working prototype and then into a production system that we're building at the moment. So here's some of the questions, the practical questions, is how do I publish internal data? Because a lot of the data that we produced was produced for internal purposes, not for the web, and not for other people. So how do we publish internal data so external audiences can understand it and use it and enjoy it? Cultural heritage data, David was saying this, isn't static. How do you keep your open data up to date? What happens when something changes? How do you integrate data, enrich it, and that's what we do, we harmonize data together to enrich it, while maintaining local meaning, context, and perspectives. Because as museums and cultural heritage organizations, we all have different structures, we all have different vocabularies, and those perspectives are really important. How do we derive new knowledge and preserve it? So when people use it, how do we bring that data back in to the institution and preserve it? How can you fulfill the requirements of a wide range of audiences? So how can we put it in a state where it's relevant to a wide range of audiences? And actually efficiency is quite an important aspect to this as well. And how do we, in the end, provide stable and sustainable platforms for creating user applications? One of the biggest disappointments of the linked data world is the lack of end user applications. And this is really important, and this is one of the things that we are trying to resolve. So this is Tim Berners-Lee. This is a famous sort of TED presentation that he did, and he got the crowd to chant raw data now. This is a chance to try and get people to put their data up onto the web. But there is a problem with raw data, and this is one of the problems that we're trying to solve, because raw data doesn't necessarily have all the rich information that you want. So this is a picture of our internal collections management system. There's a record there, and it has lots of tabs: object, location, acquisition, production, find, spot, association. This is very familiar to anybody who's got a collection management system and manages cultural heritage information. But actually it's made up of very different layers. So there is a database, usually a traditional database underneath, a relational database. There are some business rules that try and make sense of that data. There's a user interface, and actually the people who use it are filling in the gaps. There's a huge amount of implicit information in these systems because they were never designed to go outside. They were always designed to be used by internal people with training who build up that data. And a lot of that implicit information resides in this layer, and in this layer, and not in this layer, which is where we publish our data. So this is a really big problem. UCL, University College London, did a survey of the British Museum's collections online system. And they found that people could generally find what they're looking for, but only if they knew what they were looking for in the first place. So people who were browsing collections online actually found it extremely difficult to get results that were relevant to them. And again, this is important. So the quote I took from that report, this is Melissa Terrace at the UCL, the majority are seeking a known object and utilise discipline-specific search terms. So I was saying before that we have internal data that we produced for ourselves, and we simply take it and dump it onto the web and expect people who have not got those discipline-specific terminologies in their head to try and find it. And we need to try and widen it up, because if you want this digital data to be used by a wider range of people, it needs to be put in terms that people understand. And again, this is from the same report. Browsing in a museum environment is somewhat problematic, as users have to be fairly linear in their search strategies with little satisfaction when searching broadly and browsing. Research is about, initially at least, browsing broadly. You want to browse at a high level before you go into the detail. So this is a really big impediment and a problem between the institutions and the academic community. But it's also a massive problem for engagement. Where do you start? How do you explore the data in a given institution if you're a general user? How do you get enjoyment out of that data? How do you move across it? How do you find things that are unexpected? So this is problem 2. We leave the representation of knowledge to technologists. Because all the tools are quite technical, because linked data is generally quite technical, and because no one's produced end-user tools that are for our subject experts, we leave the representation to programmers. This interesting cartoon that I found on the web about that. Oops. So we're trying to think about data slightly differently. Generally, when representing data on the web, people are thinking about it in terms of the constraints that the computer puts on it. And we end up with closed world data in an open world environment. We end up with flat representations, and we end up with simply a table and field mentality. Whereas what we're trying to do is say, let's ignore the computer, let's think about how these things should be represented, and then let's work out how we can then get them into a computer environment. This has poor reuse value. Quality is a really important thing. There's a lot of thing about big data and getting big data out onto the web and using it. But actually, if it's not a good quality, then it has a very poor reuse value. So we're spending huge amounts of money picking up very low quality information that actually is never going to drive a digital economy. And what usually happens when we aggregate this data, particularly in the cultural heritage world, is that we use fixed models. The programmers do not understand the data, so they create models that they do understand, which then means we squeeze all the goodness of our cultural heritage data into a single model that's been conceived centrally. So this is a quote from David Behrman in 1995. Donna was part of the RAMA project, Remote Archives Museum, Remote Access Museum, absolutely. This is around this time, and lots of projects were trying to squeeze data into these centralized models and having very poor success. And this is what he said: it's essentially impossible to bring data from existing museum automation systems into a common view, fixed values, fixed structures. Increasingly, it seems we should have concerned ourselves with the relationships between the objects. And this is the point at which the CDOC CRM was conceived. So David Behrman's talking about a problem that we've never fixed up until this date, but we've known about. And what it results in, and this is from Europeana, but Europeana is representative of lots of different aggregation projects. This is not a Europeana specific problem. But what we end up with is the original record from the museum being fitted into a fixed model, which it wasn't designed for. So this collection is foreign archaeology, but in here, it's actually in type. And the subject is not the subject of this object. It's taken from somewhere else in the record, simply because they have not been able to accommodate the diversity of different organizations and simply try to fit it in to a single record model. This is another one. This one's slightly worse in a way because computers take you as your word. So this is type image. So this to a computer would infer that the ancient Egyptians were able to use digital cameras, which I think we know isn't true. So representing culture, I wanted to make a contrast between what we do with data and what we do in museums when we're putting exhibitions together of objects. Because I think the contrast is quite stark. So this is something I took from the British Museum website, and it's an exhibition that was put on about Australia, and the curator has done a little piece saying it's a big responsibility to put together an exhibition that does justice to the cultural and historical complexity of the story of Indigenous Australia, a story that's still unfolding. So these exhibitions take an awful long time to put together, 3 to 5 years typically. So a lot of work goes into it, and we don't just shove the objects into a room and put a few labels on. We're very, very careful about telling a story, telling a narrative, looking at the significance and relevance, leading people through. We're very conscious that different people will be looking at those labels and those objects, and we want to make sure that those stories are relevant to all of those different audiences. So this is a very different approach to when we put up a website with object records. We tend to just shove them up there without any regard for the context about these questions about relevance and significance. They're simply put up there as a reference for people to use or not. So I'm saying we need to think a bit differently about data and digital representation. That's a bit obscure, I know. But actually, the ontology that we use, and this is just a side thing, is actually based on theories from Wittgenstein. But we can talk about that later. So one of the things we need to do is if we're going to publish into the real world, we need to stop using our internal concepts. We need to keep our internal vocabularies and structures, but we need to use a universal set of concepts. So there's another way of putting that. So this, if anybody's read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this is Deep Thought, who was constructed to answer the ultimate question of life and the universe, and came up with the answer 42. And the discussion was the computer didn't really understand the question in the first place, but it suggested that in order to make sure that people did completely understand the question, that you had to build a real world model, a real world computer. So we're trying to move the artificialness of these types of computers and work with the real world, and that's what ontologies are about. They're about representing the real world in a way that computers can understand. So we need to agree what we're talking about. We don't necessarily have to agree with the details of those objects, but we initially have to agree that we're talking about the same thing. That can be extremely difficult in a big data environment. So these are more practical issues. We need to solve some issues about the fact that we didn't produce this data in the first place in systems that were designed for the web. So when we start publishing, and it doesn't matter whether you're publishing in CDOC CRM or anything else, if you want to publish out to the web, you suddenly realize that some of your data management issues come to light. So some of the stuff that you weren't doing in recording your data become really stark. Stuff like syntax normalization, which refers to cleaning up data. So people putting different values into fields, not keeping to authorities, delimiting their text in text fields. All of this stuff is a problem for structured data. So we're starting to think about what is the right relationship. If you're an aggregator, what are the things you really need to think about in terms of your relationship to the provider of that information? No aggregator sorts out all of these issues, and therefore all aggregators potentially have a sustainability problem. There needs to be analysis of the data initially. There needs to be thinking about data versioning, syntax normalization, terminology mapping. You've got to start mapping your terminology. Schema matching, link checking, instance matching. How do you know that this person is the same person in this other set of data? How do you know this is the same place? In cultural heritage data, we have sometimes very well documented places and people, and sometimes we don't. And some of these people and places are not in some of these global resources that we have, like VF and ISME and the Getty. They're local heroes. They're people who are important to our museums locally, but don't have a global presence in any of these international systems. We need to stop seeing data as a second-class citizen. So I was looking recently at a report by the Audit Commission into libraries in the UK, and what it found was that UK library stats falls in numbers of facilities, visitors, and books issued. And they had statistics about the fact that visitors to libraries were dropping. But if you looked carefully, actually the drop in physical visitors was fairly small. The big drop was digital visitors. Okay? And this is an interesting quote from a book called Beyond the Book, Schnapp and Battles. The information explosion, far from serving the needs of the burgeoning knowledge economy, intensifies the need for quality information and expertise that libraries and librarians provide. We're overloading, we've got too much data, it's becoming dumbed down and it's becoming useless for the people it was designed for in the first place. So one of the things that we've started to do is do workshops that separate out the technical aspects of knowledge representation. So there's all of this technical stuff to do with linked data, but actually initially it's about knowledge representation. It's about how you represent your knowledge externally, which isn't a technical thing at all. But because all the tools are technical, cultural heritage experts haven't had access to them. So one of the things we're starting to do is create tools that separate off knowledge representation from the process of actually publishing it as linked data. And this is an incredibly important stage. And we've got tools now that we'll be showing this afternoon that do this. And we've started doing these workshops. It's the first workshop we did at Yale University. And most of the participants were non-technical. And yet, we managed to get 30 people producing linked data, cultural heritage linked data, who had no experience of producing linked data before, simply by concentrating on the knowledge representation first, and then looking at the technical thing as a separate aspect. And it made it so much easier for people to understand. So leading on to that, so what are we doing? We're trying to do a lot with actually very little. This is the CDOC CRM. So one of the things we're doing is we're trying to make the CDOC CRM more intelligible for people. So this is a new diagram that shows it. Ultimately, the CDOC CRM is about the interaction of temporal things with permanent things. It's about the events and activities that surround that interaction. It's event-based. The CRM is an event-based. It's different levels of knowledge, and it allows different levels of knowledge to be integrated. And we have all of these things around it that provide additional support, like identity, appellations, places where, people and groups, time, and types. This is where our vocabularies go. Vocabularies are incredibly important. I'll be doing some research on vocabularies when I start my DPhil here. But they're not very good for integration. You can't use vocabularies for integration in cultural heritage. It's a waste of time. We've tried it over too long a period, and it's never worked. This is one of the things that that the CDOC CRM tries to resolve. So we've been obsessed in Western philosophy with universals of nouns, of adjectives and substantives, of pot, embossed, all of these naming words that we've lavished on our records. But Bertrand Russell would say that those are the most uninteresting parts of our data. The interesting parts are the universals of relationships. This is what makes data interesting. Not these things, but these things. And this is the things that the CDOC CRM concentrates on. And those are the things that actually allows us to integrate data. So Donna's always talking to me about how to explain this in a user-friendly way. So I found it. I found a way. This is a toy that I bought my daughter 10 years ago. Was it 10 years? I can't remember. Parents don't remember these things. The 20Q, 20 questions based on animal, vegetable, mineral. The Victorian parlour game. It's based on the Linnaean classification system. So it's got a real history to it. But you can play it online. You can play it on your phone. You can download it as an app as well. That's more fun, but that one's still. So I was thinking of. Well, it got it right, because you can see I've done the results. I was thinking of a painting. And in this system, it doesn't recognise vegetables in the same way that the Victorians would have seen them. It wouldn't have had another option. In this one, it's got other. So it's animal, vegetable, mineral, other. But in Victorian times, something that was derived from natural things would be a vegetable. So I decided to be traditional because I'm a very traditional person. Classified as a vegetable. Is it usually green? So it starts off by thinking, well, it is actually a vegetable. Does it have seeds? Is it round? Does it grow over time? No. Is it found in mines? I'm not sure about that question. Does it taste good with butter? No. Is it pleasurable? Yes. Would you use it daily? No. Is it colourful? Sometimes. Does it taste good fried? It still thinks it's a vegetable. No. Is it cold? No. Does it taste good? No. Is it square shaped? Sometimes. Do most people use this daily? No. Can you play with it? No. Is it used by the police? That's an interesting question. No. Do you hold it when you use it? No. Does it break if dropped? And on those questions, it knew what I was thinking of. These are a set of contextual questions that 85 million people have answered in order for it to derive the right answer. There's a universal understanding about the context of these, or the things that are the questions that provide the context for what we're thinking about. And this is how CDOC-CRM works, except we're much more sophisticated. I hope. But there's essentially this. So that means that CDOC-CRM can take little bits of information and can take information from different data sets and actually work out what something is. It can actually fill in missing information by using this system. Is that a good way of explaining it? I don't know. Okay. So what we deal with in ResearchSpace is lots of different types of data from different organizations, whether it's libraries, there's something there from the Rijksmuseum, there's some bibliographic records, there's a British Museum record, etc. And of course they're all different, they all have different structures and all have different vocabularies. But actually you can overlay a semantic framework on all of them consistently with universal concepts. Productions, information objects, inscriptions, existence, appellations, destructions, beginnings, births, deaths, expressions, visual items, etc. These all apply to all of these different data sets, and they create what is a graph, a semantic framework around all of these things that means that we can then integrate them without touching. Donna said in Clarosh, we don't touch your data, we don't alter your data. This doesn't alter your data at all, it simply provides a semantic framework that it puts on top that allows all of these things to be integrated. Extremely sophisticated. Sophisticated enough for us to create inferencing and reasoning rules. We can put logic rules into this to get new information out, produce new triples, new linked data. And once we've done that, we can align them. And we can put the time, places, people, perspectives on those semantic frameworks, and we can look at the relationships and connections and similarities. So it's not just about direct connections, it's about similarities. It's about indirect relationships as well as direct relationships, which again I will be covering on my ID fill hopefully. So some of you may have seen this diagram before. It's the British Museum's data in a linked data format. If you zoom into it, you can actually read it. It's readable, not like a relational database. If you look at a relational database, you'll see all these funny field names that you can never decipher. In this, it's all in plain English. And although it looks complicated, anybody can follow it. And it's quite big because the British Museum have lots of different object types, and we fill in different fields for different objects, and we generally make things complicated for ourselves. This one is the one that we did in April. So Sebastian and I put together a semantic framework using exactly the same entities that were in the British Museum data, but for the AIS data. And so they integrate, even though they're on something completely different, immovable objects as opposed to our collection objects. This is one we did for manuscripts, Book of the Dead. This is using a specialization of CRM called Ferberu, so it's based on Ferber, but nevertheless, all of the classes are still based and are subclasses of CRM, so they integrate. So you can integrate manuscripts and bibliographic resources with collection objects and immovable objects. It doesn't matter. They're just specializations of the same thing. And we can move this into the web as well. So this model can extend. You can't see the details of this, but we actually embed some of the CDoc CRM in the web page itself, so we can start tagging text, contextually tagging text, and not like TEI, where it's a more syntactical thing. We can actually start embedding meaning, context into text and aligning that with our structured data. And what happens is that these things integrate. They may integrate directly, they may integrate because there's a fragment here that makes meaning between these two relevant. And as we add more and more data, we get richer and richer relationships. So what else are we doing? I said that we were doing workshops where we were talking to non-technical people, so we produced a non-technical mapping tool. And we'll look at this again in this afternoon's session, so you can see how people, non-technical people, are mapping. You can see the things that were done at Yale in this tool as well. This is completely free, open source. You can register it for yourself, and you can start mapping your data as soon as you like, and making linked data very, very quickly. And I said in 2 days, 25 to 30 people produced CRM linked data.
So where do you find this?
I'll publish it. All of these slides I'll make available with the links. So those CDoc CRM models were and did look quite complicated, and they were quite big. And if you were searching for those and using all of the different relationships in a UI, then it would make it extremely difficult for people to use. The CDoc CRM is very, very compact. It covers the whole of cultural heritage, but it does it in a relatively small number of entities, about 80 entities and 120 properties, which is really compact. It's actually more compact than our relational database alone in the British Museum, yet it's far semantically richer. But nevertheless, we need to have a framework where it's easy for people to search on. So what we do is we abstract what we call fundamental entities from all of those other entities, thing, actor, place, event, time, categories. And we have relationships, and we abstract from the detail more abstract relationships to make it easier for you to access that data and make user-friendly applications out of it, whether they be graphical or text-based. And we'll look at those a little bit at the moment, later as well, and I'll show you an example at the end of this one. I did put some technical stuff in. I know Donna will not like that, so I'll take that out. But ultimately, we're producing these things that create that as standard open source code that you can apply to your CDoc CRM independently of us. Everything we do will be available on the web for downloading, even the applications, all the tools, everything. You don't need to rely on us. And what we do is we produce then an application that makes use of these relationships in a search system, that makes use of the relationships and the context that you've embedded in. So this is, I'm going to do, actually I'll do that at the end. So I'll show you an implementation, because we'll do the detail this afternoon, but I wanted to emphasize that this stuff is not just for cultural heritage. We've actually implemented it on Wikidata. So we're actually making mappings between CDoc CRM and Wikidata, and we're doing it on our terms. We're not allowing people to dictate the terms of that relationship. We're actually taking the lead, because we can use Wikidata. A lot of it hasn't got any provenance, but we can actually, through research projects, produce and combine and create provenance for it. So this is a really important thing. We're hoping Wikidata, this is a pilot for Wikidata, but we think they certainly will be taking the platform, and almost certainly they'll be taking the search system we've produced as well. Example of projects we're doing with it. So we currently have some work going to establish a project on Hokusai, and this is the sort of things that we do with CDoc CRM. So original sources, correspondence, the painting manuals, the digital images, biographies of his life, all of which can be combined in one single resource in an RDF store using CDoc CRM. So we can start asking some really fundamental questions about Hokusai and answering questions that we haven't been able to answer with traditional methods. So again, an important step forward. And one of the most important innovations we now have for the CDoc CRM, which is completely missing from the digital world, is the ability to apply an epistemology to digital resources. So this is, again, a subset of CDoc CRM that allows us to create arguments. So researchers can argue on canonical data produce their own alternatives, and it's all linked and the provenance is all there. So observation, belief adoption, inference making in a very, very simple model, and in an interface that you would never know was a CDOC CRM one, we can produce chains of argument and provenance of argument that goes back years and years and years. In cultural heritage, there are arguments that have been going on for a long time, and small mistakes in those chains of arguments can result in mistakes over millions of years, especially in archaeology. So there's still some work to do on the Claros system, but we've started putting the Claros data into the ResearchSpace system using the fundamental category and relationship search as the logo at the top. That will be released fairly soon, I hope, and we'll send you links so you can have a look at it and see what you think. Not only do we use a search to get to a basic result set, but we use relationships to facet down as well. So it's all based on relationships, not on naming words and nouns. And so I'd like to conclude to say, actually, this is wrong. Tim Berners-Lee is wrong. It's not raw data now, it's contextual data now. That's really, really important. And I'm not sure that he understands the importance it has in cultural heritage. Maybe I'll ask him next time I see him. Thanks.